I whispered to her that I did not wish the military police to know that I was staying in Linz, otherwise they might ask too many questions, although I had a proper and satisfactory explanation. She said at once that she knew the very place for me. The girl of the house, her father, was a railway man, hated the military police just as much as I did, for she had had to suffer their insults on more than one occasion. There was an alternative house, the old woman said, where I might stay. There were 2 girls in that house, beautiful girls, and if I wished, her wink was more than suggestive. But the moment she had mentioned that word, railway man, my mind was made up. Obviously this was the place I wanted. I shouted a goodbye to the men with whom I had been drinking, and went out to find my billet. The man was at home eating his evening meal. He explained to me that he was on night duty and just about to set off for work. His wife was bedridden, and he left it to his daughter to arrange the necessary terms. She was a typical girl of the district, not particularly good-looking, but strong, bigly built, and very active. Her name was Suzanne, and she proved to be a very good friend to me. I did not go abroad that evening in case there should be some system of patrolling the streets which might lead to my discomfiture. Instead, I stayed in and talked to Suzanne. Immediately, I had told her that the landlady of the estaminet round the corner had sent me to her. She looked at me very curiously. Suddenly, after I had talked to her for an hour or so on every subject under the sun, although she had kept me at the distance proper between a French girl and a German soldier, she had been perfectly friendly. Suddenly she exclaimed, "Since when have you been a German?" I was flabbergasted as she continued accusingly, "You are no German, you are French." Of course, I protested vehemently, but she would not hear me, although I could insist with truth that I was not French at all. "We've been talking about dancing. Now say to me in French, 'I want to dance with you 20 times.' I said it, and immediately she gave a cry of triumph. "I knew it," she said. "There, no German could ever say dancer properly, and certainly he can never get the V in vingt right." In any case, she continued more seriously, "When someone is sent to me by Madame Sophie, I am looking for something. You might just as well be honest with me, for I knew immediately I saw you that you were not what you appeared to be." This naturally gave me a bit of a shock. I wished at first that I had left Madame Sophie and her damned estaminet a mile behind, and had sought out quarters entirely for myself, unassisted by French intelligence agents. But as it happened, I had no cause to regret the chance which led me to Suzanne. There are some people whom you trust almost implicitly from the first hour. Suzanne was one of these. I discovered later that although she had done no actual intelligence work, she had, on occasions, carried messages from Madame Sophie to someone in Douai. As Suzanne was quite unsuspected, she could do this without inviting the attention of the police. Before the end of the evening, I decided to confide the whole plan to her. It might be a risk, but it had to be taken. Already, by some intuitive instinct, she had guessed that I was something unusual. If she were a traitor, she could denounce me already, but Suzanne was no traitor. She agreed that neither her father nor mother must know anything whatsoever of what was happening. Although we wanted information from her father, it must be got in a roundabout manner. Yes, she said, he would be able to tell us anything that was wanted. He had been a shunter at the sidings at Evian, within half a mile of the main junction, for a good many years. The next day, walking casually along by the road which led by the railway, I spied out the land. My first choice, which I had made by the map, was the obvious one. My next task was to find how it was guarded. There was a signal box close by, and I noticed a sentry on guard. Apart from this one man, however, there seemed to be no question of interference, for the next sentry was a good quarter of a mile away. That evening, over the meal, we pumped Suzanne's father for all we were worth. I let her ask the questions, since already she knew half the answers from previous conversations, and she knew well what I wanted. Soon I found out several important facts. One, that while troop trains came by the northern Dunny-Lens line, supplies were usually transmitted by the southern line, which branches off the Douai-Arras line a few miles southwest of Douai. I learned also that the ordinary divisional supply trains worked to fixed routine and were seldom more than a few minutes out of their time every night. What was more important, I found that the man on sentry at the signal box had formed an unofficial habit of going into the signalman's cabin about 2 o'clock in the morning, when the signalman made coffee, and taking coffee with him. He would only be away from his post for a matter of 5 or 10 minutes, and all the while, if he cared to look, he could watch the line through the windows of the signal box. Nevertheless, the fact was well worth remarking. So far my plans had proceeded literally without a hitch, unless my unmasking by Suzanne could be called a hitch. But on the actual day of my attempt to wreck the railway, I had the fright of my life. For that day I wandered about Lens for an hour or so, looking out for useful details, without the slightest interference. Any town behind the line on either side naturally contained a large number of unattached soldiers, who might legitimately be in the streets on all kinds of errands. The military police could not possibly detain everyone, nor would it be policy to do so, for official business would become impossible. But even as I was returning to Suzanne's house for a last meal, I was halted by a sergeant of military police. He was perfectly friendly. However, in fact, he was a surprising contrast to some of the military police I had met in our own army, whose conduct was not always particularly edifying on all occasions. Indeed, when I considered that this man was a German, and the German discipline was supposed to be about 10 times as severe as ours. I pondered very deeply, for after examining my papers, he was perfectly satisfied, but pointed out that I would have to hurry if I was to join my regiment by midnight, for this was the hour that was marked on the papers which I showed. I have mentioned that I carried 2 or 3 of these leave papers, each with a different date. He was good enough to tell me the nearest way to Hullock, and actually put me in touch with a lorry driver who was taking a load of barbed wire to an engineer's depot that same evening. Naturally, I thanked him very much for his information and advice, and promised to avail myself of it, so I went into the nearest cafe, ostensibly for a final drink, and then moved on in the direction that he had indicated. After half an hour I reversed, and got back to Suzanne's house by a roundabout route. One thing I was very disturbed to notice in Lens. Our attack was ostensibly a secret, yet everyone knew about it. Already local reserves had been warned to be in readiness, yet I saw no sign of army reserves in the neighborhood. Maybe it was not too late, although either of our overzealous and easily seen preparations, or more probably loose tongue wagging somewhere in staff or political circles, had given the Germans the hint that the attack was about to come off. When I say staff circles, I don't necessarily mean English staff circles. My experience was that 80% of the information which found itself in German hands, and which ought not to have done, came from French GQG, for many of their officers were far too talkative. Their politicians were quite incorrigible, even at the most critical phases of the war. About 1 o'clock in the morning, I left the house prepared to do or die, or even both. Suzanne wanted to come with me, but of course I would not hear of it. This was no woman's job. It might even not be a man's. I made my way without challenge to the railway, and hid myself in a ditch beside it, keeping a careful eye on the sentry. He had a beat, and was walking up and down, for the night air was chilly. In fact, in my ditch I was deadly cold, for the grass was wet and my feet were in water. At 2 o'clock, however, the expected happened. I saw the door of the signal cabin open, and one of the signalmen came to the door. The German went inside. I could see him drinking his coffee, even if there was official connivance in taking the coffee. Certainly this man failed in his duty, for his back was turned to half of the track, which he was supposed to guard. This was my opportunity. I had, of course, everything prepared. Very quickly I slipped 2 charges under the rail nearest to me, and prepared the fuse. Then I went back to my ditch to wait for something to come. I knew I ought not to have long to wait. A supply train was due at 2:30, but actually it arrived nearly half an hour late. This accident, however, helped my plan, for to my joy I saw another train advancing on the other line. If the engine driver were alert, it might be possible for him to pull up in time. Otherwise, disaster would be certain. It was. I timed my fuse so that the charge did not explode until the engine had passed. Necessarily, it was only a light charge, since I had carried it in my pack, but it was quite sufficient to twist the metals and fling the trucks with violence onto their side. In fact, it was a hopeless smash, and to my glee, the leading truck fell over the actual junction. That is to say, it would be quite impossible for a train on either track to pass until the line had been cleared. Then I watched. Would the other train pull up in time? No, it was impossible. It was but 100 yards away, and with an even louder crash, the engine ran at a good speed straight on into the maze of shattered trucks all over the line. The confusion was redoubled. Already men were shouting and running from all directions. I myself rushed to the scene. There was no reason whatsoever why I should not see precisely what damage I had done, and in any case it would not do for me to be found hiding in the ditch before I reached the actual spot where the troop train had derailed and some of the coaches had turned over. However, there was a terrific explosion. I was flung backwards, and it was lucky for me that I was still on comparatively soft ground. As it was, when I got up, I found myself bleeding in half a dozen places, although, on investigation, the wounds proved to be the slightest of abrasions. What had happened? It was soon fairly obvious. The engine of the troop train had charged right into the middle of a truck loaded with ammunition, and 2 or 3 trucks of heavy shells had exploded. The scene was appalling. I ought to have jumped for joy, because now there was no question of a mere 24-hour delay. Even with hundreds of men and dozens of cranes available, it would be at least a week before this track could be cleared and relayed. My job was done, and well done. Had I not been a sentimental fool, I would have cleared out at once and gone back to SPY Bernard, there to pick up my pilot and to return home. But alas, although I had been in the army for over a year, I was still a civilian. I simply could not face the appalling scene about me. There must have been several hundred men in the train, and the greater part of them were killed or wounded by the explosion. On every hand, men were groaning, screaming, and hurt. It was more than I could stand. Foolishly, I allowed my better nature to get on top of me. Better nature is a poor comrade in war. I went to some of the men and began to give what help I could. I tore up the clothes of dead men to make bandages for the living. I worked at frantic speed. Every few minutes I said to myself, "You idiot, you must get away. You'll get caught as safe as houses. Everyone will be suspicious now. They might easily round up all the men on the spot. Get away, you fool." Then I would catch sight of some poor brute lying maimed and helpless, and would go to his aid. By the time the situation was in hand, I was completely all out. The mental strain, the physical work, and the revulsion of the scene had affected me greatly. By now, of course, hundreds of men were on the spot, and medical officers were attending to the wounded. An orderly came to me, seeing that I was exhausted, and not only insisted that I should cease work, but led me off to a medical officer, who roughly bandaged my wounds and ordered me to hospital. As he was dressing me, a major, who had taken charge of the relief operations, came up to him. "This man deserves recognition," the doctor said, after a little conversation. "He has worked tremendously hard, and has done a lot of good work." The major turned to me and demanded my name and regiment, which of course I had to give, and he promised me that my colonel should know of my good conduct. I might even, he said, be recommended for a decoration. The fat was properly in the fire now, I thought, as I was hauled up in an ambulance to hospital for further treatment. What an idiot I had been! Why had I not followed my second instinct, rushed at once to Suzanne to have my wounds dressed, and then made a bee-line to SPY Bernard? Now I was going into hospital, and it might be the very devil of a job getting out. At hospital I was treated remarkably well. Apparently the driver passed on the word that I had done useful work on the spot. The doctor who treated me took the greatest pains with my small wounds. Then I was put to bed, and in spite of my mental agitation, so great was my exhaustion that I slept for an hour. When I woke up, I stared hard at the man in the next bed. It was the sergeant of military police, who had offered to find me the lift to Hulluch. Immediately I had to think of excuses. He wanted to know, of course, why I had not done as he suggested. I told him that I had lost my way and had missed the man with the lorry. Even that did not explain why I had not set out on foot. There could be no explanation to that, so I pretended that I was still confused. It was quite obvious that he was suspicious, not that I was anything but what I professed to be, but that I had deliberately neglected to join my regiment. Fortunately, he too had heard the story about my conduct on the scene of the smash, and he hinted that it was a good job, that I had such a record to show to get me out of trouble when eventually I did report to my battalion. Maybe he was waiting for my brain to clear a little, but if so, he waited too long, for suddenly there came through orders to clear the hospital at once. The expected attack had materialized, and hundreds of casualties might be expected within the next few hours. I, of course, was not a wounded case at all. My scratches, if they could only be kept clean for 2 or 3 days, would not cause me the slightest trouble. So I was fitted up with a uniform, for my own was soaked in blood, and actually given a letter of recommendation to the colonel of my regiment. So once more I set off, not towards Hulluch, but towards the regimental depot at Carvin. By this time I was told Hulluch was in the hands of the English. I had to restrain my jubilation. I was at any rate glad to see that there was apparently no suspicion whatsoever, but that the disaster had been a pure accident. That was where the second explosion, that of the ammunition trucks, had been a godsend to me, for the destruction it caused would, I hoped, completely eradicate all traces of the small explosion which had started the affair. So I set off on the road towards Carvin with a light heart, determined at the earliest possible moment to turn south to my rendezvous with young Palmer. I was very intrigued to see the great confusion behind the German front. I had imagined that we on our side had a monopoly of confusion, but it was obvious that some of their commanders were really rattled. Troops were being hurried towards the front along the very roads down which other troops were streaming back. I talked with as many as I could of the latter. They said that they had suffered a tremendous defeat, that the English had broken right through, and that the Fraulein soldiers, as they called the Highlanders, were actually in the suburbs of Lens. I chuckled beneath my anxious face. It was obvious that the minimum of reserves were on the spot if our attacking forces had already reached the suburbs of St. August. Then all we had to do was to throw in our reserves, and Lens was ours. Behind the town was open country, and no reinforcement on any large scale could arrive for many hours. At nightfall, I turned about and began to make my way south. Several times I passed military police, but no one had any questions. So great was the confusion of troops passing and countermarching in all directions. I had no map, and had to depend upon memory and intuition, and in the darkness I lost my way and found myself on the outskirts of Lens again. There seemed to me to be something wrong. If we had been in the suburbs of Lens in the morning, why were we not in the place itself by now? Then another idea came into my head. If we were so near occupying Lens, why should I not lie low in a cellar and wait until the English did arrive? I decided to call in at Suzanne's house for further information. I did, but she had none. She was tremendously concerned to see me. She fully realized the danger of my position and urged me to go at once to the clearing near SPY Bernard. I needed little urging when I found that noise of battle had come no nearer to Lens during the day. In fact, it appeared to have largely died out, and off I set again on my lonely journey. My path led close by the junction, the scene of my exploit. As I was passing, I saw officers examining the line by the light of great flares. To my discomfiture, a witness was the sergeant of military police, who was evidently giving his version of the events of the previous night. At once I turned about, intending to make a big circle around the scene, but my luck was out. That police sergeant was indeed my albatross. He sent one of his men running towards me. He must have had keen eyesight, for I was 100 yards away at the time, and although the light of the flares was strong, it was by no means daylight. Now I said to myself, I am surely done for. This is the third time this man has hauled me up. Although he won't have any suspicions, he will have me arrested as a deserter, and that is precisely what happened. The officers were endeavoring to ascertain the cause of the disaster, for the railway transport officer at Lens had apparently refused to believe that it could be by accident, and then, by an atrocious piece of bad luck, they had found a small portion of fuse which had not been consumed when I had fired my charge. I saw a staff officer holding it in his hands, looking at it with great curiosity. Yet I retained my calm. How could he tell that the fuse had anything to do with me? But I had to face at once the catechism of the police sergeant. "What the hell are you thinking of, man?" he cried. "You do yourself a good turn, and then undo it all again by not obeying orders. Don't you realize that you have overstayed your leave in such a manner that you are now classed as a deserter? What have you to say for yourself? I began telling him a long story about how I had got to Carvin and had found that my regiment depot had moved back and nobody knew where it was, so that I had returned to Lens to get further orders. By this time he was suspicious. That is to say, he refused to believe that I had made any serious effort to get in touch with my regiment. Naturally, he had no suspicion otherwise. He turned to one of the staff officers. "This man, sir," he said, "says that the depot of the 138th Bavarian Regiment has been moved from Carvin. Can you confirm that?" "No, that isn't so," the staff officer replied. "I was on the phone to them there only this afternoon." The military policeman looked at me very sourly. "I think you had better come along with me," he said. "I'll hand you over to my chief." Without ceremony, one of his men and himself escorted me to the office of the German equivalent of town major. By this time I knew that the slightest slip would mean complete exposure. The only thing to do was to brazen things out. Soon the telephone was humming. The town major laid down his receiver, turned to me and said, "Why did you say your depot was no longer at Carvin?" "It is. I am just talking to your adjutant now." Then I must have got lost. I got to what I thought was Carvin, but there is such confusion on the road today, owing to the battle, that I might easily have been mistaken. He got on to the telephone again, and I heard one end of his conversation, which disconcerted me, yet gave me an idea of what to say next. "Your adjutant tells me that you were reported missing 5 weeks ago," he said. "That's quite right," I agreed. "I was taken prisoner by the English, but I escaped a week ago, and was then given leave. I am just on the way to rejoin my regiment. Evidently the adjutant does not know that I escaped." He asked a good many more questions of the same type, punctuating them with telephone conversations with my adjutant. At last he turned to me and said, "There's obviously only one thing to do. I shall send you under escort back to your unit for trial. It's a very lucky thing for you that you have this letter of recommendation with you, because at the time of a battle courts-martial are apt to make the first example that they possibly can." So off along the Carvin Road I passed again, this time in a light lorry with an armed policeman on guard over me. Naturally, I made no attempt to escape. All the while I sat quiet, chatting only very occasionally to my escort, but thinking deeply of what I had learned from the man I was impersonating. I felt fairly confident, because surely I had pumped Ernest of everything of his family history. From his description, I recognized the adjutant as soon as I saw him, but my heart fell when by his side I saw a staff officer. I had seen him before, by the light of the flares at the scene of the smash, holding a small piece of fuse in his hand. It was the staff officer who opened the investigation. "Do you recognize this man?" he asked the adjutant. "Certainly I do. He is Private Ernest Karkin, who was reported missing after the little attack 5 weeks ago." "You have not seen him since," said the officer. "No, he has never been reported to you as having escaped, or having been sent on leave." "No," the adjutant confirmed, "certainly not." That is what amazes me. Surely we would be informed at once in the event of his escape. You are quite satisfied that this is the man?" "Quite," said the adjutant. "At least, so far as I can see. I don't know him too well. His hair is distinctive, but if you want to be quite certain, let us bring in some of his immediate, non-commissioned officers to identify him. Better still," the staff officer pointed out, "let us see if he can identify some of the officers or men in his battalion." This remark frightened me intensely, for I knew from the moment that he was definitely suspicious of me. However, I came through my first test with flying colors. I affected some show of disciplined indignation. "But, sir, this is absurd," I cried to the adjutant. "Of course I am Ernest Carcon. Do I not know you, Captain Norden? Do I not know Sergeant Major Lick and Orderly Room Clerk Hyde? And of those men outside, is not the sergeant with the ginger mustache Sergeant Thurowin? I forgot the name of the corporal with him." "Well, that sounds all right," said the adjutant, but the other officer was still unsatisfied. He was a cute man, after my own heart, except that I would far rather have had him on my side than on the other. "Send for some of his personal friends," he commanded, and I waited anxiously. About 5 minutes later I felt happier, for 4 men were marched into the office, and 3 of them, either from description or from photographs, which my involuntary tutor had shown me, I knew at once, and, what was more, knew a considerable amount about them. The 4th, unfortunately, I could not place. It was strange to see their eyes light up at the sight of me. Great grins spread across their faces, in spite of the foreboding presence of the 2 officers. They had of course given me up for dead, as I had not been reported a prisoner. "Do you know this man?" asked the adjutant of them. "Of course," they replied, almost in unison. "He is Ernest Carcon." "And do you know them?" asked the staff officer of me. "Of course," I echoed. "The first man on the right is Henrik Domnau. His father is a baker in Munich. He has a wife and 2 children, but he forgets his wife occasionally. He can tell you a very good story about a brothel in Lyle." Henrik looked hard at the ground. The others grinned, and even the adjutant lost his stern expression. "I seem to have heard something about that," he remarked. "Something about the man's clothes being taken away, was it not?" "That was it." "And next to him is Joseph Friedlander. When I was taken prisoner, he was serving a sentence of 7 days, punishment for dropping the officer's coffee." "Is that so?" asked the staff officer. The adjutant agreed that it was so. "And the 3rd man," I said, "is Peter Meyer. He and I have been in the regiment together since the beginning of the war. He can tell you all the campaigns we have made. We fought against the French in Alsace, where he was wounded, but very soon came back to us. Then we were transferred to Arras and later to here. I can tell you any details you like." I did, in fact. I gave them quite as much detail of the regimental history during the war as ever a private soldier would be expected to know, but the staff officer did not seem to be interested, and I knew I was making no headway. These things could be found out from other sources, as both he and I knew very well. He interrupted me in the middle of a sentence, and the 4th man, he asked. There he had got me. I did not recognize the 4th man at all. I thought back of all that Ernest Carcon had inadvertently told me. I had a detailed description of 15 or 20 people, and some casual notes about another 100 stored away in my memory, but none of them fitted this man, a mere youth of 18 or so, who was grinning at me in friendly fashion. Of course I recognize him, I explained, but I can't just think who he is. I had a nasty knock when the English took me prisoner, and it may have affected my memory. That means that you don't know this man at all, suggested the staff officer. Yet you know the others. Of course I do, I protested. I recognize him quite well, but I can't think who he is. I see, he said. Then he ordered the 4 men to march out of the room. There was no one left but the adjutant, staff officer, and attendant police. I think you may as well confess at once, he said, that you are not what you appear to be. In fact, you are an English or French spy. So it had come to that, although I knew throughout the whole of the interrogation how thin was my line of safety. I had not quite realized that his suspicion was so certain. Listen, he continued. A night ago there was a terrible train tragedy at Lens, at which you assisted in helping the wounded. Where were you when the collision occurred? I have explained before, I said, that I had a toothache and I was taking a walk because I could not go to sleep. I can show you the tooth if you like. Oh, he exclaimed, there is no doubt, I suppose, that it was a genuine collision. You heard no sound of an explosion just before the supply train crashed. None at all. I saw the trucks turn over onto the line, and then a few seconds later the other train ran into it. Oh, he continued, then you would be surprised to know that the rails under the supply train were blown up. Very surprised, I agreed. You have never seen anything like this before. He laid the small fragment of fuse on the table before me. Yes, I have, I declared, for I saw that I must be very bold. It looks like a piece of fuse. It is a piece of fuse, he said. What is more, it is English fuse. It is a part of the fuse that was used to blow up the supply train. Now have you anything further to say? Nothing at all, I protested. Why should I? Because, he continued, every word firmly emphasized. A few threads of fuse like this were found in your pack by the town major of Lens. This was a bombshell. Nevertheless, I had a story ready. He laid a few thin strings of cotton on the table beside me. There is nothing peculiar about that, I claimed. We captured quite a quantity of explosives from the English some months ago, and quite a lot of us kept back small lengths of fuses. They are very useful for blowing out rat holes. Some of us are very keen on ratting, and there is plenty of good sport about here. You have a tale ready for anything, he complained, but this last one is not very convincing. Is it true that you captured explosives from the English? He asked the adjutant. Yes, we did, though I did not know that there were fuses among them. We captured rifle ammunition and some very strange homemade bombs made out of jam tins. Exactly, I broke in. These fuses were used to explode the bomb. Very well, we will pass over that for the moment. Now you say again that you do not recognize that fourth man. No, except that I do know him, of course, I agreed. I can't just place him. You have a fiancée back in Munich, I believe, named Irma Donau, he suggested. That is so, I agreed. I have her photograph here. I pulled it out and showed it to him. You have known Irma for a good many years, he continued. "Why, yes," I said, "we have been affianced for 3 years, but I have known her practically the whole of her life, and her family too." "Of course," I agreed. "I used to go round to supper every Sunday evening before the war." "Then how comes it," he cried triumphantly, "that you did not recognize her brother, whom you must also have known for the whole of his life?" This was a shocker. I suddenly recollected that Ernest had told me surprisingly little about Irma's family, principally because he had not got on with them very well. But now, with Irma's brother on the premises, well, the danger was only too obvious. For just a fraction of a second, my mask slipped, and the staff officer had dashed in and penetrated my defense. Any police officer will tell you that you are halfway towards proving a man guilty if you are certain that he is guilty. That was my unhappy position as the guilty man. Irma's brother was brought back. The staff officer had a private conversation with him, and the youth began to ask me all sorts of intimate questions about Irma's past. I was immediately out of my depth. I pretended that I was confused, that the knock I had received when captured had upset my memory. I knew that it was a poor story. My memory had been good enough to reel out a list of engagements in which the battalion had taken part. It would not so suddenly go phut right now. After a very unhappy 20 minutes, the staff officer dismissed Irma's brother and turned to me. "I think you might as well throw up the sponge. You have done very well, and have done an enormous amount of damage. Nevertheless, I think you now stand completely unmasked. There is ample evidence. You will be tried by court-martial either tomorrow or the day after." I was marched off and placed in a hut under heavy guard. I tried hard to think of a way out, but it seemed to me that I was completely trapped and cornered. The only thing to do was to play upon my supposed confusion in the mind, if necessary, to pretend that I was mentally deranged. But alas, all my schemes fell to pieces when I was marched into the room where the court-martial was to be held. The customary 3 officers sat in their places: a grave and rather elderly colonel, a young subaltern, and a captain. And as I gazed at the captain, I had a fit of cold shivers. I had seen him before. He was one of the Bavarian officers with whom we had fraternized on Christmas Day. Would he recognize me? I have said that I was not disguised in any external way, except for my hair. I had merely adopted the personality of the other man. Would he recognize me? The question was soon answered. Even as my guard were stamping their rifles to attention, he glanced up from his papers and saw me. I saw a look of astonishment spreading over his face. I gazed at him calmly and steadily, showing no trace of recognition whatsoever, but it was too much to be a coincidence. I could almost see his mind working. He knew I spoke fluent German, for at the time I had had no reason to conceal it. The look of wonderment passed from his face. A cold calculation replaced it. The court-martial opened. The first witnesses gave their evidence. The Bavarian captain did not appear to be listening. He was still thinking hard. Suddenly, in an interval between witnesses, he whispered to the president, whose eyes stared in surprise. "Could it be done?" I heard the captain ask. "Yes, it is possible." The president seemed hesitant. "It is unusual, but it would settle the case, would it not?" "Yes, that is so. Very well, I agree. The court is adjourned for an hour." What was in the wind? I knew by now that my position was hopeless. I was almost certain to be condemned on the existing evidence. But if the Bavarian captain claimed to recognize me, I was marched back into the room. "Have you got them?" the president asked of a military policeman. "Yes, sir." The commandant of the prisoner's enclosure asked that they might be returned. "Of course, put them on the prisoner." And I saw through the scheme as the policeman produced a British officer's cap and great coat. I protested, why should I be forced to wear an enemy uniform? But of course it was useless. "Well?" asked the president. The captain had no hesitation. "Yes," he said, "it is quite definite. He is a British officer. We talked to him during the unofficial truce on Christmas Day. I remember him particularly because of the fluency of his German. One of my colleagues, in fact, was convinced that he must be one of our agents working on the British side." "You are quite certain?" "Absolutely, sir. Only the color of his hair is changed. That is what made me hesitate at first. But now I am certain. If you wish, I will retire from the court and give evidence on oath." That finished me, of course. I need not describe the rest of the trial in full, because the result was obvious right from that moment. After half an hour, in fact, I saw the hopelessness of trying to argue it out, and threw up my hands completely. I should emphasize that I was treated very fairly, and was given every opportunity that I could possibly want of asking questions or cross-examining witnesses, but of course it was quite hopeless. I would have had a very difficult job in getting round the circumstantial evidence of the fuse, the non-recognition of Irma's brother, and my other little lapse, but my recognition by this officer had made all these pieces of evidence trivial in comparison. At least, by confessing everything, I would be treated as an officer and not as a paid spy. But I wonder what instinct prompted me not to reveal my name. The president of the court did in fact so treat me with dignity and fairness. He informed me that all my wishes would be scrupulously carried out. Nevertheless, of course, there was but one verdict and one sentence. The verdict was guilty, and the sentence to be shot at dawn the following morning. I was hurried back to Lens, where the civilian prison was now occupied by military police. It was already late afternoon. I had something like 12 hours to live. I sat in my cell and began to think again. Rather strangely, I found myself not afraid of certain death. That is, not really so strange as it may sound. Actually, I have found in battle time after time that the soldier's fear is not so much of death as of pain. I was perfectly cheerful as I prepared my thoughts for my fate the following morning. I have never been so calm. At first, the end seemed absolutely inevitable, but naturally I spied around to see if there remained one chance, however minute, of escape. It was not very hopeful. My cell was one of a series in a long corridor. It was securely locked, and it was quite impossible to force the door. In the passage outside patrolled an armed soldier. I timed his patrol and found that he passed my door about every 10 minutes, and as I was an interesting and unusual prisoner, he peeped in through the wire-guarded little hole in the window every time he passed. Evidently, he had the strictest orders to look at me. So, considering everything, I decided that the end had come. I had now only to look forward to death. As the soldier passed on his patrol, I called out to him and asked him to send the governor of the prison to me. He came. He was a very decent old fellow, sorry indeed to see an English officer in such a plight. It was obvious that he held a strong admiration for what I had done. He was a fairly elderly man, and doubtless for him the war would pass without any outstanding military glory. He bore me no spite at all. We talked about such things as esprit de corps among officers. I told him, for example, of how the submarine officer who sank the Aboukir, Hogue, and Cressy was held in high esteem in the British Navy, despite the tremendous damage he had caused. The governor, for his part, did his utmost to make my last hours easy. He told me I could command what food I wanted, and any wishes within reason he would be only too glad to carry out. As I could think of absolutely nothing to ask, for that would help me in any way to escape, I could only ask for writing materials, to pen my last letters home. But I did also ask that he would take some steps to procure an English uniform that I might be shot in, my own uniform and not in that of my adopted country. He promised to do this without fail. It was long after dark when he had left me, and by the time he had returned with the writing materials, all about was very quiet. The uniform would be ready by morning, he promised. It was he himself who made the suggestion, which was to have such tremendous consequences, for he asked if I would like to see a chaplain. Strangely enough, I had never thought of this, although it is the usual thing to do when a man is about to die. Nor for I must confess it frankly, was I tremendously keen on seeing a chaplain as such, for in his last hours, as at any other time, an ordinary man is just as capable of communing with his Maker by himself as by the assistance of any outside person. However, in my state, I was rather glad to see anyone. There were a lot of small commissions which I would like to be done, and as chaplain would probably be able to execute them better than the governor of the prison. In fact, it was his job, so I agreed at once that I would like to see him. While I was waiting for him, I began my last letter home, and it was not until I was in the middle of my letter to my mother, who was dearer to me than anyone else in the world, did I realize how near to death I stood. I experienced a sense of futility. I felt as I had often felt before when I saw young men going to their death in battle, that my life was being wasted. After all, there must be a great deal which I could do for England and for humanity, and now I was to disappear into the void. I had done something, it was true, but I felt I could do even bigger things. I left off writing in the middle of the letter, and once again paced about the cell. Was there absolutely no chance of escape? Was there any possibility of a last-minute reprieve? The answer to those questions was an obvious and very emphatic negative. Had I built a cell for a prisoner myself, I could not have done it more strongly and securely. And as for a reprieve, well, the damage I had done and the lives I had caused to be lost gave their own condemnation to such a vain hope. But at the moment the chaplain entered my cell, once again I felt a gleam of hope. The governor, having ushered him in, left us alone. I asked how long I was to be allowed, and the governor replied that there was no time limit. Doubtless I had a good many last commissions, which the chaplain would be only too glad to attend to. I thanked him very heartily, and said that I hoped my business would not occupy more than an hour or so, as I did not wish to deprive the chaplain of his night's rest. Even before the governor retired, leaving us alone, I was taking an acute stock of my new visitor, for in the sight of him some new hope had been born in my brain. He was a man 10 or 15 years older than I was, not quite so tall, and of a slightly lighter build. His looks did not resemble mine in the least, for his hair was very dark, whereas mine was dyed fair. In addition, he wore a dark mustache of the toothbrush variety, so popular at that time in both the British and German armies. He also wore spectacles with a powerful lens. Nevertheless, my experience as an actor told me in 5 seconds that given a supply of hair dye, crepe hair, and spirit gum, I could easily pass myself off as this chaplain. This alone was enough to create a new hope in my heart. He began to talk to me very quietly and sympathetically. Naturally, he spoke of matters of the soul, endeavoring to prepare me for the eternity which I must face in the earliest hours of the morning. I listened to him, seriously, looking hard at him the while. Actually, I scarcely heard a word of his homily. All the time my brain was a whirling activity. My scheme, which took less than 5 minutes to evolve, was doubtless crude, but my position was desperate. Even if it failed, I could be in no worse position. Under the pretense of getting a better light, I moved the small camp table with which I had been provided. The patrolling sentry rushed to my door at once when he heard the movement of the table, but I set him at his ease by asking him to fetch another chair for the use of the chaplain. This brought, we both sat down under the eyes of the sentry at the table, and very cautiously I so arranged things that we both sat with our backs to the door. Then, before the sentry marched off on his 10-minute patrol, we were both immersed in the letters which I had been writing, and I was giving the chaplain my last instructions. At all costs I must play my part, thinking well ahead. Everything must be done in 10-minute intervals, so when the sentry next returned and peeped through the little window, my head was in my hands, bowed over the table. Evidently my spirit was failing me, for the chaplain was addressing me seriously and sympathetically. The moment the sentry had passed, I recovered. Then standing up and talking over the chaplain's shoulder, I began to point out 1 or 2 details that I had written down, to which I would like attention to be given. The first critical moment had arrived. I was thinking back 10 years to my boyhood days at Lodston Hall. There in the village lived a poacher named Ziggy Porter. He had made so many appearances before the local magistrates that he himself had lost count of the number of his convictions, although he was, as he used to say, a centurion. But in spite of his many deviations from the path of rectitude as laid down by man-made laws, Ziggy was a great fellow, naturally popular with the youth of the village, and even with the elders, since he was such a wonderful man with animals. There never was a dog for 10 miles around which would not leave its master to run at Ziggy's beckoning whistle. He had always been a great favorite of mine, and though I ought to blush to confess it, I had been out with him more than once on his nocturnal patrols. I had even committed the heinous crime of poaching my own father's rabbits, and as I stood behind the chaplain, I recollected one of the little tips which Ziggy had given me. Seated in a ditch in the middle of an autumn night, we had just caught a rabbit. He held up the rabbit by its ears, administered a sharp slap with the side of his hand, and the rabbit was dead. He went on to show me the exact spot on the neck where you must hit the rabbit. He also declared that there was a similar spot in the human neck, which, if slapped sharply, would not indeed kill a man, but would knock him completely unconscious. He went so far as to show me on my own neck the exact spot on which the rabbit punch must be used. A short, jerky slap, hard with the side of the hand on a spot about half an inch below the lobe of the ear. I had never actually tried this rabbit punch on a human being, for want of a suitable subject, but it was the only possibility available to me now. I could have laid out the padre with a struggle, but not without noise, so I determined to risk everything, including my life, on Ziggy's rabbit punch. The chaplain, bending over my papers, could not have put his neck in a more favorable position if he had tried. Twice I lifted my hand, and twice I hesitated. Was it some old ingrained inhibition that restrained me? Was there something inside me which forbade me to strike a man of God? But when a man is approaching certain death, such inhibitions are easily suppressed. The third time I raised my hand, there was no voice of conscience or anything else to stop me. His face fell sharply onto the table before him. He made no further movement. Ziggy's rabbit punch had indeed justified itself. Now I had to work very quickly. I had about 5 minutes left. Very hurriedly I stripped the chaplain's greatcoat from him and donned it myself. Hastily I added his heavy-lensed glasses. Then I put him in my own chair and arranged him in the last position in which the guard had seen me, that is, his head sunk in his hands. I turned my own head away so that he should not notice my hair. There was no time to do more. If you find it difficult to believe that this occupied 5 minutes, just try to take an overcoat off an unconscious man. The guard came, peeped in. but saw nothing to rouse his suspicion. So far as he could see, I was still rather overcome, and the chaplain was still droning his melancholy sympathy, for it was quite easy for me to assume the voice of the chaplain, which was a high-pitched, rather monotonous, and certainly a distinctive tone. Then I hurried. Had I had my make-up box from the theatre, my task would have been easy, but here I had nothing except the things actually before me. However, if your hair is light and you want to make it dark, you can make some sort of a show with ink. It is not a commodity whose use I recommend for ordinary social purposes, but in the ill light of a military prison it might pass. Very quickly I took the bottle of ink, with which I had been so kindly provided by the governor, and daubed it on my hair. I searched the chaplain's pockets and found there one of the small steel mirrors which most soldiers used to carry. The effect was quite passable, certainly enough to deceive an unsuspicious observer. My crucial question was the moustache. Crepe hair cost about 6d. a yard, and spirit gum cost 2d. a bottle. An inch of crepe hair and a spot of gum might mean life and death to me, yet these, of an intrinsic value of about a farthing, were the very things which I had not got. Therefore I must find substitutes. Now it was more important that my moustache should be above suspicion than my hair, since the hair would be largely covered by the military cap. Hurriedly, therefore, I searched the chaplain's pockets again. I should have said that in the meantime the sentry had passed once more. I could only do one job in each 10 minutes interval. I wanted a knife, for my own had naturally been taken away from me. To my joy, I discovered something better. The chaplain was an officer, very correctly turned out, and in his waistcoat pocket was a minute pair of toilet scissors. I cut off a small lock of his own hair, for although he wore it short, in correct military fashion, he had a forelock of considerable length. Here, then, was my moustache. How to fix it? How to fix it so that it would stay on just for 3 or 4 minutes while I got out of the prison? Well, I had no spirit gum, but I had envelopes, and on the back of envelopes is gum. My fingers, once so experienced with this kind of thing, cut the hair into suitable lengths. Then I licked a dozen envelopes so that the gum was loose, then rubbed them on to my upper lip. I put the hair in position. Would it stay on? I moved about, jerked my head from side to side. A few hairs fell out, but most of it held. I looked again in the mirror. Yes, the effect was quite passable. I felt a great excitement and a dawning confidence. There remained only the difference of height, and that the great coat would help to disguise, for I could effect a stoop within. A greatcoat which would be immediately detected were there no coat to hide it. I had a few minutes left. Hastily I scribbled a note apologizing to the chaplain for my churlish behavior and collected all my own papers. I arranged him finally with care and precision, his back to the door, his head in his hands, so placed that the color of his hair could not possibly be seen through the little window. As the sentry approached the door, I rose, donned the chaplain's cap, and patted the unconscious man on the shoulder, calling to him in his own distinctive voice some final consolation. Then I strode towards the door with the sentry unlocked. He gazed curiously at the recumbent form. "Leave him there," I said in the chaplain's voice. "He is rather overcome, but he is now prepared to meet his God. He will meet his fate bravely." Quite unsuspicious, the sentry locked the door after me and escorted me down the corridor to the office of the governor. I did not enter the office, which was well lighted, but suggested that I wished to regain my billet immediately. I reported that I had left the prisoner well prepared, and that he still had 1 or 2 more letters to write, which doubtless the governor would forward to their destinations. As I made to move off he thanked me, then to my consternation he said, "Well, I'll just go and have one final look at him and see if I can persuade him to lie down. He's a brave man, and I know he would like to meet his death bravely. But a man who has been pacing about all night often appears nervous. I'll just go along and have a final word with him." This was rather disconcerting. I had estimated that it might be an hour at least before my trick was discovered. Still, it only made action all the more urgent. I said good night, saluted stiffly, and one of his men took me to the gate of the prison. Happy moment! I stood there under the starry sky and the hunter's moon. Free again, the impossible had been accomplished. I had escaped. How long would my freedom last? Even now the governor was walking towards my cell. Within 5 minutes perhaps the alarm would be raised. In my extremity I thought, as I had thought before, immediately of Suzanne. It was strange, I commented to myself as I hurried down the almost deserted street. Here was a girl I had only known for 3 or 4 days, and yet willingly I would place my life in her hands. It is fortunate that there are people like that in the world. I scarcely stopped to think of the risk that I was bringing upon her, because I knew very well that that was the last thing she would wish me to consider. Her house was but a few 100 yards from the prison. I did not knock at the door, but at her bedroom window. Was she asleep? I doubt it, for in a few seconds she was at the window, calling in a whisper to me, and strangely enough she did not ask who was there. It was as if she were expecting me. She opened the door, and as I entered, flung her arms about me. She had heard, as had the whole town, that the terrible collision had been engineered by a British officer disguised as a German. She had heard, too, that I was to be shot at dawn. It was a moment for tears, yet she was far too practical for that. In fact, I have never known a woman with such an instantaneous grip of a situation. In 2 sentences, I whispered to her what had happened. My present problem needed no explanation. It was fortunate in one way that we were alone in the house. Her father was as usual on night duty, and her mother, who was, as I have previously mentioned, I think, an invalid, had been taken to hospital 2 days before. First, to dispose of the chaplain's wardrobe, which I had borrowed so effectively. In a thriller, the hero would have dissolved it in acid, or something ingenious like that, but I had no acid and no time. Further, there was one obvious method of destroying the clothes which would not be mentioned in an ordinary work of fiction, yet many hundreds of thousands of men who served during the war in Flanders will remember those antique and insanitary lavatories which were the sole form of sanitation in most of the country towns in this region. They were mere sumps, which were cleared out periodically by a municipal machine, which looked like a Shell-Mex lorry, with a giant vacuum cleaner tube attached to it. If you had a nose, it was unnecessary to see the lorry to know that the work was being performed. In a moment, therefore, I had stripped off the chaplain's greatcoat, his cap, and his glasses, and had stuffed them through the lavatory seat. To remove the moustache was the work of a second. It was precarious enough already. My hair I left as it was. There was no time to wash it with the thoroughness which would be necessary if my head was not to be completely piebald. All this took but a few minutes, yet we were not too soon. We heard a small commotion at the end of the street, and to our dismay found that it was caused by a patrol of German soldiers. Suzanne opened the door an inch or so, and reported that they were obviously going to make a systematic search of the street. She heard one man calling out, "I tell you I saw him come down here." Yes, once again urgent action was necessary. It was Suzanne who saved the situation. Maybe all my inventive ideas had been used up in my escape. Maybe the sensation of achieving freedom had damped my thinking capacity. I stood and I trembled. I must frankly admit, had it not been for Suzanne, I might have given up the attempt. But she hurriedly took me into her bedroom. We had not shown a light in the house. There had been no one about as I had entered, and if the Germans were going to search the whole street, there was no reason why they should suspect this house any more than any other. "Get undressed quickly," she commanded, "and get into bed with me." "But what's the idea?" I began. "Leave it to me," she said. "Get undressed." I did. I flung off my clothes and dumped them on the ground. I was still, of course, wearing the German uniform in which I had been arrested. Then, clad only in my shirt, I climbed into bed beside Suzanne. What a strange situation. I had never been what is usually known as a man of the world. This was the first time I had ever shared a bed with a woman, and under what circumstances. Yet I felt no thrill of sex as the warm body of Suzanne pressed close by my side, for the bed was narrow. We could hear those soldiers in the street. In another minute or two our ordeal would have begun. I could feel Suzanne wriggling about beside me. "You've got the idea, of course," she whispered. "You were a German soldier on the bust. I'm a prostitute. Play up to that. Let me do as much of the talking as possible. You can be half tight." I was only too content to leave it to her, for I had the utmost confidence in her mental agility. The investigating patrol wasted no preliminaries. They did not knock at the door, but burst it open, almost before we realized that they were in the house. They were in our room. I played my part. I sat up in bed, blinking and looking about me stupidly, as a man who had just wakened from the heavy stupor of a love sleep. But Suzanne went for them, tooth and nail. "How dare they come into a lady's room?" she stormed. Her voice had lost its softer tone, and she had assumed the hard shriek of the professional girl. Then I took up the story. "Yes, bloody fine pals you are," I complained sleepily. "Can't a chap have a bit of skirt without other people coming barging in the middle of the night? Go away. I've hired the girl for the night, and I'm going to have her." The two men stared, yet their astonishment was nothing to that which was to follow a second later, when Suzanne got out of the bed. Now that mysterious wriggling revealed itself, she had been slipping out of her night dress and stood naked before them, the complete prostitute, brazen and unashamed. "You go away," she wielded in the pidgin German which all the professional girls behind the German line naturally learned. "You go away. Me engaged for tonight. You come again tomorrow." The two men stared at her youthful body, well built and pleasantly rounded. They saw also the invitation in her eyes. Their own were literally staring out of their heads. They were not used to receptions of this kind, but one of them made up his mind very quickly. "Yes, mademoiselle," he agreed. "We come again tomorrow. Tomorrow night, eh?" "Yes, tomorrow night," called Suzanne after them. 5 francs for a whole night. 2 francs for 1 hour, eh?" We heard the broken door slam behind them as they proceeded to the next house. Never were soldiers so convinced as these two. The patrol moved further down the street. Immediate danger was over. I sat on the edge of the bed, an incongruous figure in my rough army shirt. Then, as Suzanne turned to me, I put my arms around her warm body and kissed her. She clung to me, and I kissed her again, and I meant every word I said when I told her that there was no other girl in the world like her. I would have left her. She had risked enough for me already, but she would not hear of my going. She argued truthfully that the streets of Lens would be ablaze with patrols, that it would be impossible to miss them, and that every man abroad on the streets that night would be under suspicion. She insisted that I should remain with her throughout the whole of the following day, so I spent the rest of the night washing ink from my hair. It was not entirely satisfactory, so in the morning, while I hid in the attic, Suzanne went to a chemist's and bought a hair dye which turned me into a medium blonde. I remained in the attic throughout the day. Nothing happened. Although there were reports of great police activity, our street was not further troubled. Apparently a cordon had been drawn about Lens during the night, which might make my escape all the more difficult, for I was determined that, come what may, I would leave Suzanne's house that night. If I were discovered, it would mean death to her as well as to me. Yet before I left, there was a further scene to be played. Soon after nightfall, a soldier knocked at the door and entered without invitation. He was one of the patrol who had visited us the previous evening. He had now come to take advantage of Suzanne's invitation. She put him off cleverly, but it was agony for me, who saw the scene through a crack in the door, which led to the attic stairs. Half a dozen times I was tempted to come out and strangle the sensuous brute, and dump him where I had dumped the chaplain's overcoat. But there again, that would have been more chivalrous than wise. He didn't like it a bit when Suzanne put him off by telling him that she had already engaged herself for the night to a sergeant. He wanted to know why he couldn't have 2 francs worth before the sergeant came. She naturally wouldn't hear of it. Nevertheless, in her character of a prostitute, she could not object when the man kissed her and pawed her about in a disgusting fashion. My blood boiled as I saw him clumsily fingers feeling her rounded breast and straying sinuously over her body. Never did a good girl play a braver part, and never did that man realize how near he was to sudden death, when finally, still grumbling at the bloody sergeant, who always picked out the best girls, he decided that he had better retire before the sergeant arrived. She rushed to me as soon as he had gone. I held her in my arms in the dark and miserable attic while she sobbed out her heart, but such was her spirit that she soon pulled herself together, and it was she who wiped the perspiration from my brow, for I believed that my ordeal of watching and restraining myself had been almost as great as hers. Then we planned the final details of my escape. Her father had slept in the house throughout the day, but had known nothing of my presence. We had considered it just as well that no unnecessary person should be involved. It was the sight of him, unknown to himself, that had given me an idea. Surely a railway man could walk about with greater freedom than most others. So Suzanne picked out some old working clothes of her father's. At nightfall she went to the woman of the Osteme, who had first sent me to her, and demanded the loan of one of the laissez-passer which the German insisted that all civilians behind their lines should possess. Thus disguised and armed, I was well prepared to take my chance. Actually, my most terrifying moment was my parting with Suzanne. She tried to make me promise to enter into no more adventures. I, for my part, endeavored to persuade her to come with me, but she would not leave her father, and particularly her mother, so naturally I did not insist. Then I kissed her for the last time, and strode confidently down the streets of Lens. At the octroi I was halted by a military patrol, but my papers were passed without hesitation, and 2 hours later I had reached that open space near SPY Bernard, where Palmer would pick me up. But would he? Was he still keeping the rendezvous night by night? I waited until the agreed hour, 1 o'clock in the morning. Yes, high up above there was an aeroplane. Whether it was German or English, I could not tell. I made no attempt to signal, for it was too high above. Lower and lower it came, and I knew that Palmer had not deserted me. I lit an automatic cigarette lighter, which Suzanne had bought for me, for my torch had naturally been taken away in the prison, and 5 minutes later the aeroplane had come to rest in the green field. 20 seconds after that I was inside it, and immediately we took to the air again, rising high in our flight over the line. Thus I came home. I slept at the aerodrome and went on the following morning to Army headquarters. There I was received and overwhelmed with congratulations. They had known that my exploit had succeeded, but not of subsequent capture. Sir Douglas Haig himself was good enough to compliment me on what I had done, and Colonel Hilton informed me that I was to be awarded the DSO. So, on the whole, I felt fairly satisfied with myself, and particularly glad to be alive. As with a voucher for 14 days' special leave in my pocket, the wheezy train jogged its way towards Calais. It is advisable at this stage to gather up the thread of this first part of my story. Suzanne, what of her? Had this been the conventional spy fiction, I would have returned to her after the war and have married her. Lowly rank would have been no obstacle. She would probably have turned out to be a long-lost heiress. Unfortunately, this is not fiction. I did indeed return to her after Lens had been captured in the British advance in the last weeks of the war. I started when I saw her. Was this emaciated creature, thin and pale, the round-bodied Suzanne, who had so excited the sensual admiration of that German patrol? I was no doctor, but it needed little medical knowledge to see that something terrible had happened to Suzanne. Not only to Suzanne, but to hundreds of thousands of unfortunate civilians who had remained in those parts of France and Belgium which were behind the German lines. Not all the relief commissions in the world could have saved them. 4 years on, a diet of nothing stronger than cabbage soup can lead only to complete emaciation, and very often to the dreaded tuberculosis. That is what had happened to Suzanne. As I saw her, only her eyes were the same, those keen, friendly, intelligent eyes which had won my confidence the very first moment. I rushed her off to the hospital at once. A few days later I returned, and talked to the doctor in charge. He shook his head gravely, and uttered the saddest words in the world. Too late. A year earlier, he said, and there might have been some hope. But now, well, the disease was galloping in its progress. I asked if he would object to a second opinion. He welcomed it. During the last month of the war, I was, as I shall explain, a person of some little consequence at British headquarters. A very famous physician, a world authority on tuberculosis, was a brigadier general in the RAMC at Tréport. I took him to see Suzanne, though I knew instinctively that his journey was useless. Suzanne's mind remained as alert as her body grew frail. I visited her frequently. Always she had a smiling welcome for me. Only once she broke down. I would have liked to have lived so as to have my memories. The longer, she whispered, nor were my eyes drier than hers. She died on June 27th, 1919. I was acting as an interpreter at the peace conference and could see her almost every day. That evening she seemed in great spirits. I had been detailing the terms of the peace treaty, which the Germans must sign at Versailles on the morrow. So this is the end of the war. Her voice was so faint that I had to strain to hear her words. And France has won. Well, my Bernard, we did our bit to help, didn't we? Nothing so pleased her as when I talked of those exciting days at Lens. So I prattled of our thrilling memories till she tired. I smoothed her pillow and settled her to sleep. Did she know, I wonder, that the end was near? To me she looked the same as yesterday and the day before. But in the intensity of her last handshake, I felt the bones of her hands bite into my palms. Even before I left her room, she was almost asleep, still smiling. My car waited in the courtyard. The chauffeur reported a fault. The engine would not start. He located the trouble, but it took half an hour to put it right. Just as the recalcitrant engine decided to function, I saw the matron of the hospital descending the steps. She said no word, but at her beckon I got out of the car. We went back to the room. Suzanne was dead. She was still smiling, even in death. I went outside and walked away, anywhere. I forgot the car. I walked through the night, alternately crying like a child and cursing furiously. This was the real end of my Lens adventure. I did not think till afterwards. I got the DSO for my share. Suzanne got nothing for hers. Many French and Belgian women received British decorations. It would have been easy to have obtained one for Suzanne. It was my fault that this was overlooked, but neither of us cared for honors of this kind. But England and France ought not to forget. The war has a rare gallery of brave and resourceful women. In its roll of honor, the name of Suzanne Bocquillon of Lens deserves a very high place. And was it worth it? Was the result worth my chance of a firing party? The world now knows the story of Loos, how the Highlanders of the 15th Division swept over Hill 70 and charged impetuously into the suburbs of Lens. There was a complete gap in the German line, with no other organized fortifications for 40 miles. Why, then, was the battle lost? Why was the gap not exploited? Was it because German reserves came up? No, it was because our reserves did not come up. Due to circumstances which I shall describe later, I did not hear the true story of Loos until after the war, how Sir John French kept the reserves under his own control, handing them over to Haig hours too late. A friend of mine on his staff told me how the taciturn Haig, discussing the battle soon afterwards, had exclaimed with unusual bitterness, "If there had been even one division in reserve close up, we could have walked right through." When I heard all these things, I was stricken again with a sense of futility. Here I had risked, and nearly lost, my life in a successful effort to prevent the arrival of German reserves, while we actually lost the battle because of the absence of our own. I may be pardoned if I thought and said hard things about the staff work involved. No wonder that the British method of fighting a war is known as muddling through.